Welcome to another Mod with me, where we will cultivate a creative connection to the subdued world of the Solara Occulto Tarot of the Hidden Sun. Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today we are going to be trimming and edging the Solara Occulto Tarot. This intentionally distressed deck with its worn gilding right out of the box feels a bit like a treasure that's been passed from reader to reader. Yet as we'll see, I still feel it needs a little creative loving to truly make it connect for me. And this is a tarot deck that is very new to my collection. I haven't even used it yet. I mentioned this deck in my video on decks that I wanted to work with in 2020. And this is a deck that it was new to my collection towards the end of the year, and I really do want to work with it because I think the artwork is absolutely stunning. I love the minimal color palette. It's so interesting. It is very much based on the Waite-Smith renditions, but you know, it kind of does its own little thing here and there in these neat little quirky ways, which I really like. And I think the color palette is just stunning. But one of the issues that I have with this deck is that it is gold gilded, which it actually, to tell you the truth, doesn't feel too terribly bad. It's not like super sharp like some of the gold gilding is. Now this deck is intentionally distressed, so the gilding has been intentionally worn to give it that distressed and aged look. But I'm just not a fan of gold gilding in any form, so distressed or brand new. Matte gilding is a little bit better, but it's just not my favorite in general. So I'm going to be taking it off. However, I do kind of like this gold border around it. I'm generally not a fan of borders, but at least if they're colored to match the deck, that works for me a little bit better. So I'm thinking that I'm going to actually take it down and leave just a hint of that border. I do want to take off all the titles because there is a card somewhere in this deck that has a misprint, so that kind of bothers me. I'm also not a huge fan of the titles and then the numbers, just the actual numerical numbers coming beside it. I would have preferred them to be at the top, but again, this is all personal preference. Because I know that that's an issue in here, and that's an issue for me in particular with this deck, I'm going to go ahead and trim the titles off. It is very Rider-Waite-Smith, like I said, so I don't think I'm going to have any trouble recognizing the cards. So my plan is basically just to trim off this gold gilding to make it a little bit smaller, remove the titles, but I am going to try to retain some of this gold border, like a micro border really. So I'm going to leave a little bit of a border around. If I change my mind, I can always take it off later on, but I can't put it back, or I can't easily put it back. So if that's something that I'm going to do, by doing it in stages like this, I'm allowing myself to have that opportunity to try it first with just the leaving on a micro border, and then if that doesn't work for me, then I can go ahead and take it off completely. Again, that's more work, but you know, it's all good. It's all in good fun. So let's go ahead and get started on this project. Today we'll be following our usual process, which means I will be trimming one side at a time on the entire deck to ensure that my deck is measured and cut as precisely as possible, because that actually helps with shuffling later on. It's a little bit more tedious, but totally worth the extra effort if you want a deck that shuffles really nicely when you are finished. So the first thing that I'm going to do is grab my little washi tape, because that's always handy for my marks. And I'm going to go ahead and actually, let's start with the bottom, because I have a lot more playroom on the sides and the top. And on the bottom, I have to cut it at a certain measurement in order to get those titles off. Now, hopefully these titles are all printed at relatively the same place, and I could go through and measure all 78 cards. Actually, I think there's a few more. There's some extra cards in this deck, but I could go through and measure them all, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to go ahead and work off this one card to start with, trim them all at the same measurements, and hope that it comes out correctly. I can always adjust a little bit here or there as I need to. But to start with, I'm trying to not make this a super lengthy or super complicated process. So I'm also going to have my ruler out here because I will use that to help me determine where my blade is going to hit. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just drop my card in here and see about where I think it's going to be. And I'm using my ruler to see. So my ruler, I think I've mentioned this in other videos, the width of my ruler, or the width of my ruler pretty much matches the width of this area between the guard and where the blade comes down. So by using my ruler here, I can determine where exactly my blade is going to cut. And if I go right here, I'm not going to quite get those words off. So we're going to go right here, and that's not going to leave much of a border at all. So we'll just have to kind of play it by ear to see if that's even going to work. That's going to give me a micro border that is as thick as my ruler. So we'll see what that looks like. You know what they say about best laid plans, sometimes they don't always work out. So now that I have my idea of where I want it to be, I'm going to put a piece of washi down there to hold my card in place while I'm lining up another piece of washi to create my mark, because again, I am not on a full line here, which is something that happens quite frequently, but drives me a little bit crazy, to be honest with you. I'm actually going to get a fresh piece of washi because this one's actually starting to get pretty crumpled and losing its sticky. So we're going to go ahead and measure here. So one of the things I really like about trimming a deck is that, for one, it makes it usable for me. So a deck that's really large is hard for me to hang on to and hard for me to use. So by trimming it, I make it something that is easier for me to use. Now by edging it and doing all of that to it, I'm just adding to the deck aesthetically. And that just helps me to bond with the deck and to kind of give it its own personality that is sort of an amalgamation between myself and the deck. So let's go ahead and give it a little cut. Fingers crossed, because it's looking like that's right. But I don't think I got, much of a border at all. So now the thing I'm going to have to be careful with is, because often one of the reasons that people like to use borders on decks is because you don't have to get the printing 100% exact. And that's like not a dig at the deck creators, it's just the way printing works. Trying to print something straight, even mechanically or mass market, it can be quite difficult. So by adding a border, if that artwork is a little bit off-centered, it kind of helps to visually adjust for that. So it's looking like maybe my border might be a little bit fatter on one side than the other, but I think that will be fine. So here's my little title, and you can see probably that it really cropped in right at that text. So that's great, worked out great for this card. I think the micro border is going to be pretty cool. The only concern I have is it going to be the same on the rest of these cards? And the only way to tell is just to go ahead and start cutting. So I am just going to double check for this next card, just because I just want to make sure, it should be in the same place, but you never know. I'm also trying to make sure that, and here's going to be the issue with the micro border. Now I cut that at the exact same measurements. So if we line these cards up, they are exactly the same size now, but as you can see, the printing on this card was shifted down a little bit more than it was on this card. So what does that mean now? That pretty much means that my whole idea for a micro border just went out the window, because this discrepancy is going to bug me. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and switch tactics, and I'm just going to trim it down to the artwork. And now I'm going to have to make some minor adjustments, because here we're talking about that plan B. Things don't always work out the way that you think they're going to. So I'm gonna try to cut both of these cards as close to the artwork as possible just to get it off, and then I'm going to remeasure again with these cards, and then I can use, when I cut my top, I can use that side to make those minute adjustments that I may need to get these two cards even, because now they've both been cut at separate dimensions, right? So that's a thing. That is a thing. So for right now, I'm not even going to bother moving my washi. I'm just going to cut and hope for the best. Okay, so that one worked out well. I'm right down there at that artwork. Also, the thing to note, when I cut the border off, I guess since I'm going to cut the border off all the way, it's going to take off this copyright that's on the back, which is always great because I'm really not a fan of copyright on my cards. I get the process, I get the idea. It's just not a fan. And this one is super close, so I'm gonna have to really get it in there just as close as I can. And at this point, again, we're just hoping for the best, but it did work out. Actually, I can see a little bit of the border down there, but that's okay. All right, so this is why we always have a plan B, because sometimes mods don't really work out in practice or in process the way that you think they're going to in your mind. So let's pretend that we didn't do that. No, just kidding. This is learning lessons, right? No matter how many decks you mod, I think you learn a lesson every time. I am still learning lots of lessons when it comes to deck mods, which is another reason why I like to do these mod with me videos, because I like to share those lessons with you all as I learn them, and hopefully it will help you not to make the same mistakes I do. So I'll make them for you and then you don't have to worry about it, right? All right, so basically gonna repeat the process. Probably just need to take this plastic off at some point. It's just getting pulled up too many times with washi. I'm gonna lay that down there and we're gonna go ahead and trim. Okay. And somehow I got my washi, pulled my washi up with it, but worked out great. So that's going good. I think that's gonna be fine. I think we should be able to just continue on with these measurements now and just taking it all down to the artwork. I'm not going to check each and every card, but I do always check the first few just to make sure that I'm in the right spot. So I'm going to finish trimming the bottom of the deck off, and then we'll come back and take a look at what we've got. So I got the bottom trimmed off the deck, and you can see they are still pretty close to the same size because I used those measurements. You can see that gold gilding is gone, and I've taken off all the titles, so we've gone down to the artwork because the artwork and the titles aren't 100% positioned on the card, and that's normal printing. It's like I said, it's not anything against anybody. That's just how printing works. I did find so it wasn't actually a typo, it was just an extra word, so to speak. On the Queen of Wands on this particular deck, the court cards do not have the in front of them. So it's just Knight of Swords, King of Swords, Knight of Cups, Page of Wands. Except for, so you can see here, Queen of Swords, except for the Queen of Wands. For some reason, the Queen of Wands, and she's the only one of the courts who has the word the before it. And that inconsistency that was enough to bug me, and why I decided to get rid of the titles, because that just kind of does it in for me. So for now, we're just going to continue on edging this or trimming this deck, and I am going to cut the tops off now. It looks like we're going to be sitting right about there. I always like to put a piece of washi there to hold my card in place while I'm messing with this washi over here to make my my little edge for me. And then I need to remember to take it off because sometimes I forget. All right, so I've got my next measurement lined up, and I'm just gonna go ahead and trim off the tops. Now there is no text anywhere on the top of this deck. It's all just border, so from here on out, I don't have to worry about accidentally cropping into any text that I don't want to crop into, because basically I am removing all the text from this deck. So I'm just going to go ahead and trim off all the tops, just kind of checking to make sure they are the same size, which they are. I think it's going to be a nice size when it's done. It's going to be a little bit bigger than like a tarot in a tin, a little bit bigger than what I would consider a pocket deck, but still a great size. Definitely not going to be, you know, regular tarot size. But I'm okay with that because I like a smaller deck. So I trimmed off just a little bit of the trees, and I am going a little bit, you can see here, I am going a little bit into the artwork just because it does make the deck just a tiny bit smaller, and it makes sure that I am actually getting all that border off, and I can account for the slight variances in printing from card to card. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up trimming the tops off, and then we'll check back in. Okay, I did want to pop in real quick as I'm working my way through this process and show you how I make that adjustment from top to bottom. So I talked about I have some of the cards that have a little bit of the gold border remaining at the bottom, and that you can make adjustments for that to go ahead and get that off, but still keep your measurements the same. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the bottom here, and I'm going to take off just that little sliver that is impeding my artwork. So I've taken off that little sliver, now it's there. But because I haven't cut the top off yet, that is going to allow me to still use this mark here, remove the top, and still keep it at the same height that the rest of the cards are. So that's the reason I'm cutting a little bit extra off the top, because that's giving me that playroom to allow me to make those adjustments for those areas where the border came through on the bottom. So now I was able to take the remainder of the border off the bottom, take the top off, and still keep it the same size as the rest of the deck that I'm cutting. So I just wanted to pop in and show you how I make that adjustment real quick. So I'm going to get back to taking off the tops. So now we have the top and bottom done, trimmed off all of the deck, and I did use the top to adjust some of my measurements on the bottom, and I was able to get the border off completely the bottom of all the cards. So that works out great when that happens. I can also do the same thing with the sides if I need to, and that's one of the reasons why I like to do the decks one card at a time as well, because it allows me to make those slight adjustments as I need to ensure that I'm getting, you know, a nice trim. So now we're basically going to trim off the sides. So I'm going to do all of the cards on the right side and then all of the cards on the left side. So we're just going to follow the same process, doing one card at a time. I'm going to use my little measurements or my ruler there. Just repeating this process basically 4 times 78 cards. I have no idea how much that is. I should probably do the math someday, because then I would know actually how many cuts I make. I'll have to sit down and figure that out. You know, me and math, we don't really get along, but make sure that I'm straight, make sure I'm pressing my guide down, make sure I'm making points of contact on the card all around so that I'm keeping it in place. And then I'm going to make sure that I bring my arm straight down. And that should pull off that right side. And it looks like maybe I might have twisted a little, or the printing's a little twisted, not sure which, but just to be sure, I'm gonna go ahead and just check it. Nope, that blade is coming down nice and straight, so there's just a tiny bit of border there. Again, I can fix that when I go to the other side, but it's really not that big of a deal. It's so minuscule you wouldn't even be able to see it. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up basically trimming the whole deck. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this side, and then I'll turn the deck around and trim the other side. It is basically the same process that we've been doing. I'm just, you know, moving my washi in, resetting, remeasuring before I do each side. And that's allowing me to get those nice straight cuts that will keep my deck even. So I'm going to go ahead and finish these up, and then we'll check in when I'm done. So now I have finished edging the deck in the Crayola terracotta, so I gave this a base. But as you can see here, there is definitely, can you see where my trimmer really kind of chunked into my cards there? I probably needed to fix that with the nail file a little bit more before I edged, but it'll still work out okay. I can go back because I'm not totally done edging this deck. I can go back and fix that, or I can leave it and let it be that sort of intentional distressing that the creator sort of intended for this deck, but just didn't work for me with the gold gilding because, again, just not a fan of gold gilding. Nothing against the deck, just not my personal preference. But you can see here, I definitely got that variegated look just by doing the single coat. And you can see here, here's some more where my trimmer was really chunking into that edging. And on each of these, it really is funny because you can tell pretty much it's where it's on one side or the other. So that definitely tells me that where I was trimming on this deck or how I was trimming on this deck really did make a difference in how well it actually trimmed. And again, I need to clean my trimmer because it's obviously got junk on the blade, and that's what's causing this this inconsistency or this worn look on the deck. Now this side came out a whole lot better. I believe that, yeah, this is the bottom, so this is the part I trimmed first. So now that we've taken a look at what I've done so far, I do really like the color and I like the variegated look on it. But what I'm thinking about doing is adding in a little bit of yellow and a little bit of the rusty hinge, so that orange rusted color. I definitely could just leave it as is because it totally works this way too, but you know me, I like to just add a little something extra to my deck. So I thought what we would do is just kind of go through and chunk them up. Now, I do want to mention that the way that I'm going to go about this process is not the way I would go about edging a deck in general. So when I edged the deck originally, I used the one marker, which was the terracotta, which we're done with, so I'm going to move out of the way. And I went through and I edged every card individually. And it's really important to do this because if you chunk it up like you're going to see me do here in just a minute, you're going to get bleed between the cards, and it's going to bleed onto the front or back, or possibly both. How much it bleeds depends on the type of marker you're using, but it's almost guaranteed that if you try to go through and just edge this, you know, holding the block together and edging it, as you're actually going to see me do here in a minute, that's not going to get you the coverage that you need, and it's going to bleed between the cards. And if you're using a marker that dries instantly like a Sharpie, you're not going to be able to get that off. It's just going to be on there. However, when I'm doing this distressing technique, I can go ahead and chunk them up because of the fact that I know that the distressed inks don't dry instantaneously. So I have time to wipe that off in between, and that's also why you'll see me do it in sections. So now that I have sanded off those rough edges with my nail file, I'm going to actually take advantage of the white spaces where it has rubbed off my marker. And I'm going to let the distressed ink, the orange, come through in those areas. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is actually distress the deck in those areas and then wipe off the excess. So I'm going to group them up together. And I'm going to hold them as tight as I can and rub on the distressed ink into those areas. And sometimes using a paper towel helps to rub it in better than just applying it directly. And that is going to allow the orange and the white to kind of all mingle together into this deck to give it that really distressed look. And you also want to be careful when you're filing that you're not pressing too hard, because if you press too hard, if you file too hard, you can actually lift up the layers that get pressed together to make the cardstock. So there's multiple different layers in a card, right? That's where we hear about like the different cores and things like that. And if you file too hard, you will peel those layers away from each other. So you want to use your nail file carefully. Basically press as hard as you need to in order to take down those rough edges, but it's better to do it gently and to kind of work the pressure up a little bit so that you're being careful not to peel away the different layers of the card. And my cards are still wet, but let's take a look at the difference. So you can see I have the darker area down here. You can see where I've sanded away some of that and then added in the distressed ink to give it that multicolored look. And if you compare that to what I have just here, we just see those kind of rough edges in that just kind of solid brown color. So these are just really like personal preference things. Look, my fingers are all orange. And this is nothing that, needs to be done. You can totally trim the deck and edge it in a single color and away you go. I just like to add these personal sort of creative and artistic touches to my deck. It just makes them feel more personal to me. And it also allows me to, spend some time bonding with my deck and working with it. All right, all done edging, and I'll show you here. You can definitely see the variegation in it. You can definitely see where it's picked up the bits of the distressed ink, where the bits of the terracotta Crayola is still coming through. And I think it looks really cool. It definitely looks rusted and distressed. And here is the final product, all completely trimmed and borderless and edged. So there you have it. That is the trimming and edging of the Solara Occulto Tarot. And I think that overall it came out really well. This was a bit of a messy trim, to be perfectly honest. Like, it didn't quite turn out the way I was wanting it to the first time. Those borders, I wasn't able to leave the micro border on like I thought I was going to. And I ended up trimming it down just to the artwork. But I think that overall, like, it looks really beautiful. And I do like it trimmed down to the artwork. I think that the whole deck really stands out. It really helps the artwork to take center stage when you remove those borders a lot of the time. And then, of course, I took off that gold gilding, which is just not my favorite. And I edged it in this variegated brown colors with the brown and the rust. And I think that came out really well. So I'm actually really pleased with the way this came out. You can see on the side here where it's picking up all of those variegated colors. So I think overall it is a beautiful trim, and I really enjoy the deck this way. I will be curious to start working with it now that I've removed those borders, made it a bit smaller. Let's just go ahead and give it a shuffle, because that's always a question when we trim a deck. That's one of the questions that I get almost every time I do a mod, is how does it shuffle? And as you can see, it shuffles beautifully. And that, to be perfectly honest with you, is because I use those measurements. And I've said it in 100 other videos, and I'll probably say it in 100 more. If you want a deck to be uniform and to shuffle well for trimming, or after you've trimmed it, you really need to use those measurements. Getting the deck all pretty close to the same size is really what allows that. And I won't say for every single deck, because there are some decks that that's just not the case for. No matter how well you trim them, they're just never going to shuffle well, because they never shuffled well to begin with. So if a deck doesn't shuffle well to begin with, the chances of it shuffling a little bit better after you trim it, that really depends on the reasons why it's not shuffling well in the beginning. If it's not shuffling well because it's too large for you to handle, trimming it down will definitely help with that. But if it's really hard to shuffle because of the cardstock, trimming that is not going to change that in any way, shape, or form. So just do keep that in mind. But I am really happy with the way this came out. I think that the cards are beautiful. I love the black and white with those pops of those rich golden and rusty colors. I mean, it just, so pretty. So pretty. Look at that Queen of Pentacles. Queen of Pentacles is my card, so it always makes me happy when I like the Queen of Pentacles. Not a deal breaker, but it's always a bonus. I really love the Seven of Pentacles too. I think he's really cool. Empress. She's stunning. Thank you for joining me for this mod with me. You will find the links to the decks and products that I've used in this video in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this process and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.